Herzlich willkommen zu einer weiteren Folge von ZeKK Live, 45 Minuten mit. Diesmal Professorin Dr. Catherine Cornille. Herzlich willkommen, a very warm welcome, dear Professor Dr. Cornille. Bevor wir starten, eine kleine Erinnerung daran, wie dieses Format aufgebaut ist. Zunächst werde ich mit Catherine Cornille eine halbe Stunde ein Gespräch führen und danach werden Sie, verehrte Zuhörerinnen, verehrte Zuhörer, die Möglichkeit haben, Fragen zu stellen, und zwar im Chat, die ich dann in die Diskussion mit hineinnehmen werde. Dear Catherine, I would like to introduce you to the audience first. Professor Dr. Catherine Cornille holds the chair for Comparative Theology at Boston College. She started her academic career in the Netherlands, where she finished her studies and her PhD in 1989 in religious studies at the University of Leuven. She stayed in London and Hawaii for academic purposes before she settled at Boston College. She authored impressively many books and articles, from which I will mention just 3. One was published in 2022 with the title Comparative Theology, More Than Comparing Theologies. And it was published in the Brill Companion of Comparative Theology. The other will be published this year, respectively next year, which will be published this year, and got the title Resisting Relativism in Comparative Theology. And next year will come out a paper entitled On the Problem of Historizing Response to Revelation from a Muslim Perspective, which personally I am very keen to read. Her research areas cover a lot of subjects. For example, theology of religions, comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, Buddhist-Christian dialogue, religious hybridity. She is, I love to say, and I'm saying obviously, one of the founding mothers of comparative theology. And I'm very happy that you could make it today for this interview. Very welcome once again, Catherine. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
I would like to start our conversation with a more general question. Can you still remember what sparked your interest at first in other religions? Was it your neighborhood? Was it the social environment? Was it an interest on a personal level, or from the beginning on an intellectual curiosity?
I think my interest in theology in general started in high school when I had some extraordinary teachers whose classes just really inspired me. And I was always looking forward to what I was going to learn from them. And that sort of sparked my interest in studying theology. And one of these teachers was somebody who also had a background in other religious traditions, and in her classes also introduced those other religious traditions. So I've always been grounded in the Catholic tradition and in Catholic faith, but I've always had a fascination for other religious traditions. And when I studied theology originally, in fact, I thought that there would be more of a study of other religions from the beginning. Which was not the case. So when I studied theology in Leuven, it was just straight Catholic theology, some ecumenical theology, but nothing about other religions. And there again, I had a professor who knew that I was fascinated by questions of interreligious dialogue, understanding other religions, and so forth. And he suggested that I might go to the University of Hawaii, and that's when I did my master's degree there in Asian religions. It has a very important center for East-West dialogue and a number of professors who are very strong in Asian religions, and that's what I did there, my master's. And ironically, it's really in Hawaii, where you may not expect this to happen, but where my real intellectual curiosity, I guess, exploded, and I decided there to continue and to go back and do a PhD in theology, where I did focus on Christianity in India and Hindu-Christian dialogue.
Which leads me immediately to my next question. When I recognized your fields of interest, your fields of research, there is an emphasis on the Hindu-Christian dialogue and on the Buddhist-Christian dialogue. Am I right to say that they may be your favorite other religions? But in fact, to have something as a research interest must not always go together with it's my favorite other religion. It could be because it's so far and so alien, I'm interested to get to know something completely different. Or maybe it's because you saw that it's most challenging and maybe more fruitful than other religions. How would you answer the question about a favorite religion, or is it just a silly question?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite religion, as I have studied more than Hinduism and Buddhism also, and I'm just fascinated by religious difference and particularity and what each religion brings to the table. So I don't know if I can speak of a favorite religion, but I think what you said before in terms of it being very alien, but also very inspiring, I think both aspects drew me to Hinduism and Buddhism. I remember the first time I heard a Hindu speak of their tradition, it was a woman who was just really deeply inspired by the figure of Krishna and talked about Krishna with so much passion and love. And at the time, I didn't understand anything. I didn't know anything about the context or the history of the text, but just her passion, I think, was contaminating, and I wanted to learn more about the tradition. I think, like many people in my generation, the kind of spirituality that's associated with Hinduism and Buddhism has always been very inspiring and appealing. And I always thought that there would be something there that Christianity could really profit from or learn from, that there was some real insight in the human mind and the working of the mind and the working of desire and all those elements that are so important in Hinduism and Buddhism, I thought could really enrich the Christian tradition. Of course, those religions are just as complex and as diverse internally as any other religion. And even though those aspects that I mentioned of their sophisticated understanding of the mind, I think is still true, but there are all these other domains or aspects of the religion that are also fascinating in their own right, not necessarily for what they have to contribute to Christianity. So
yeah,
I think, as you probably know, Hinduism is a term that's very debated, and it's a conglomeration of all kinds of different traditions and practices. So I sometimes say Hinduism is sort of this spiritual laboratory or religious laboratory where all different types of religion have been practiced and tried out, and different ideas developed and so on. So you find almost every type of religiosity that you find in other traditions, you find in Hinduism, I think. And so that makes it particularly, I think, fascinating and also inscrutable. It's such a difficult religion to get a hold of, or a set of traditions to completely master. So that's both, challenging and fascinating, I think.
There another question arises when you mentioned the woman with Hindu faith and how she introduced you to her relation to Krishna. Was it that what kind of functioned as a bridge for you to let your curiosity just move on? Because sometimes people get scared or get have difficulties to be open-minded to something which is so alien to their tradition. Would you say that personal encounter helped, or was it already when you talked about your school and your studies that there you got a kind of view in regard to other religion which was already opened and interested?
Yeah, and I think both elements have played a role, but I've always also been fascinated by what I don't understand, and always very eager to sort of try to see how I can overcome that difficulty. So, you know, but at the end of my or when I started to do my PhD in Louvain, one of the questions that I wanted to probe at the time are sort of the possibilities and the limits of interreligious empathy, sort of how and to which extent can we really penetrate, you know, the experience of the religious other. Of course, that was a way too big a question, like a PhD student, you want to answer every, you know, the big questions. So my professor at the time told me, you know, just focus on something more, you know, manageable for now, when later in your career you can come back to those questions. But so questions of interreligious understanding and empathy and what is completely alien and how one can penetrate into that world have always fascinated me. So I've never been afraid of what is different. And I want to qualify that because when I was very small, my family lived in New Zealand, and my earliest memory of religious other was my father taking me to a wake of a Maori family. And that was very scary for me as a young child. I do remember that. But I don't know how much influence that has had on the rest of my career. I don't see that as particularly important. But there was a moment of fear there. I do remember that. But for the most part, what is different is more fascinating to me than scary.
Yeah, when you talked about that woman with a Hindu background, it reminded me of an encounter I had with a representative of the religion of the original inhabitants of America, and it was so alien to my religious tradition and my religious understanding, but it was really impressive. I think it was an authentic encounter, and I went with a whole other appreciation of him in his otherness. Yes, and I didn't expect it before I entered my conversation with him. And yes, it's sometimes the academic studying of another religion combined with a personal encounter. I had read a lot of books before. It was a paper I had to write at universities, and then this personal encounter gave it a push, which I haven't expected before.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing you bring up, because I had something similar the very first time. I think I was 22 or so when I came the first time to the United States, and I also was introduced to Native American religion that we went to visit and so on. And that was also an experience where I felt like what I was hearing was sort of waking up something in me, sort of a stirring in me that I had not been aware of, or a depth of experience in me that you know, a note in me that was never played in my own religious tradition, let's say. So it really sort of woke up an element of my being that was very memorable. So what you were saying just reminded me of that.
Yes, yes. So when you have talked now and explained your way in doing comparative theology, have you kind of recognized obstacles which came up on a regular basis, which people have to overcome doing comparative theology to go ahead in deepening their understanding of other religions, or is it very individual? the different obstacles that may occur?
I think so. Comparative theology is a fairly new discipline, and it itself, I think, requires a theological orientation and attitude that every religion has to work on within itself. So you can have individual interest in another religious tradition, but unless you can bring that back to the community that you are part of, I'm not sure that it'll make much difference. So as a theologian, I'm always interested in how can I make a difference for the tradition that I'm grounded in. Now, comparative theology is not as such a natural way of doing theology, I think. Even though every religious tradition sort of implicitly has developed its own self-understanding and dialogue, or in a comparative theological mode implicitly, as an explicit discipline, it requires that religions recognize other religious traditions, recognize the possibility of finding truth in other religious traditions, and so on. And all of that is not a natural religious disposition. So comparative theology requires a kind of critical and self-critical theological orientation where each religion has to come to terms with its own claims to being exclusive or absolute, or the only, however a religion defines its own, ultimacy. So a religion has to come to terms with that, and then also with recognizing that other religions might be a source of truth. So that those are two steps, I think, that don't come naturally to religious traditions, and that have to be, dealt with first before, we can engage positively and hopefully then bring back what we learn from other religious traditions to our own. So those are some of the theological obstacles. I think, there are many practical obstacles also, just in terms of, to which extent can you really fully understand and penetrate or enter into another religious tradition? What is it that you choose to engage in another religious tradition? It's one of my articles, and my sort of critical reflection is on the problem of randomness and arbitrariness in comparative theology, because you can engage so many traditions and so many aspects of so many traditions with so many aspects of your own religious tradition. So where do you start? What do you choose to engage with in another religious tradition? And that's, I think, a big challenge for comparative theology, to demonstrate the relevance of what a comparative theologian chooses for their own religious tradition. And so those are issues, I think, that have to, that each comparative theologian has to deal with to one extent or the other. I mean, the tradition that people choose is often, also itself random. What tradition do you happen to know? Happen to be able to study where you are studying, or what tradition happens to be an important tradition in the country where you live? But that doesn't mean that those traditions have a privileged, relevance for your own tradition. So, those are again random elements. What tradition do you happen to know? What tradition has happened to be taught, or happens to exist in your country? So
yes.
It's of randomness, and so as comparative theologians, we have to justify what we do towards our own tradition, and that's, I think, also an element of challenge.
We are at the University of Paderborn. We are just stepping a step back, because last year we started a new research project, which is called Defining Islamic Comparative Theology. As you mentioned in our conversation before, that the comparative theology was to a huge degree a project of Catholic academics with a Jesuit background. we would now, and we have as Muslims done comparative theology, and now we're asking the question, how can we defend the idea of doing comparative theology from a consequent Islamic position? And in regard to questioning methods and asking whether we agree to an already well-established system, which we experienced in our academic career as being very fruitful, or whether we could maybe add questions or methods. And I'm very thrilled that what have started already very fruitful, I think, we would like to develop further at the University of Paderborn, and then see what subjects we will take off in conversation with other academics doing comparative theology.
Yeah, I'm very excited that comparative theology is no longer purely Christian or purely Catholic discipline, that it's being picked up in places like Paderborn, and I think also in Australia, and it's starting to get more and more of a foothold, I think, with other religious traditions, because of course it's not by nature a Catholic or a Christian discipline. It's just a matter of constructive engagement, constructive theological engagement with another religious tradition, wherever your starting point is. So in that sense, I think it's very important and very exciting that it's being done from different religious perspectives. I think that's the only way that, you know, religions can move forward and be more open and respectful towards one another.
I think what got clear in our conversation is that an engagement with other religious traditions is always something very fruitful, and it widens the horizon and in whatever regard. But I would like to draw now our attention to the political situation and the role of religions and theology that might play in that political realm when it comes to observations like religions are used to separate people and to argue for neglecting their dignity. And what would you say, could the insights of comparative theology could play a corrective, constructive role in this development within societies? And a more general question maybe, should theologies play anyhow or not a role in a discourse of a secular society? I hope I got my question clear. I will not.
Yeah, it's okay. They're very big questions, but just a few thoughts on these questions. I think, first of all, theology is as a critical reflection on one's own religious tradition. That's sort of how critical and constructive reflection on one's own religious tradition.
Yeah.
Has to play an important role, just because I think it's true that religions lend themselves to being used to separate people from each other. So each religion does claim absoluteness of one type or another, and other religions the very existence of other religions is always a threat to your own claims to absoluteness. So I think in that sense, religions do lend themselves to be used to separate groups and to cultivate animosity and fear and sometimes even hatred of other religious traditions. I think we have to recognize that and not ignore it or deny it, because people may say, oh, but all religions have, you know, peaceful orientation and so on. That's also true, but there is also this reality that religions can be abused in that way. So I think we have a tremendous responsibility as theologians, not to counter that ideological orientation and discourse of religious traditions. I think if theologians don't do it, I'm not sure who will counter that, what I call natural sort of fear and antagonism towards other religious traditions. So I think we have a huge responsibility to draw from the resources that of our own traditions, to show another side of our religions, to open our religions up to respecting and accepting religious others, and so on. So in that sense, I'm not sure that religion has to play that kind of role in the political sphere, although if it's possible, of course, and if there's a kind of positive contribution to the political sphere, but that would be fantastic. But I think our responsibility is first of all towards our own religious communities and towards the discourse that is held within our own religious communities. And I don't think that we will convince, secular people necessarily of the usefulness of our religion to overcome these antagonisms, but we have to work on our own, faithful, the people in our own religious communities, to show that being open and respectful towards religious others is not against our own religious identity.
In the German context, it's not natural that there is a encounter between the academic area and the public sphere. So sometimes we have evenings in the town hall to invite interested people. And we have a project between the University of Paderborn and the University of Bonn to create material that could be used to spread the insights on comparative theology to an interested kind of lay audience. How is it when you say we have a responsibility towards our own religious community? How does that spell out in your context, or how would you like that it should be spelled out? I'm interested.
Yeah, those are two aspects that don't always coincide. But I think even though theologians may not be in direct contact with people in the pews, I think as theologians, we do influence our students who maybe go on and teach in schools and teach catechesis in religious parishes and so on. So maybe there's not a whole lot of direct influence, although we, as theologians, we tend to belong also to parishes or to religious communities where we can, share our own insights with other believers. But I think it's maybe on the whole a little bit more indirect in the way we teach people who teach other people, and so on. So in that sense, a kind of trickle down effect. But I'm delighted with the initiative of Paderborn and Bonn, and the fact that the German government has recognized the value of that kind of work, and I look forward to seeing how that plays out.
I have a question related to one of your recent books published in 2020 on meaning and method in comparative theology. But because this will take maybe a longer time slot, I will give the right to the audience and will address the question of one of our listeners. Did your work in comparative theology change your own faith? And if yes, in which way did it influence your own faith? And did your fascination switch into a different kind of belief?
I think certainly, and I hope it influenced my faith. So, I mean, the things that I learned from and about other religious traditions are also things that tend to affect me personally, of course. I mean, there are some aspects of other religions that I study for purely of intellectual reasons, of course, but a whole lot has indeed sort of had an impact on me personally, and has helped me to also enrich aspects of my own spirituality and my own understanding of Christianity in many different ways. So studying other religions has also helped me sort of rediscover figures and aspects of my own tradition that I was not aware of. I do think that most religious traditions have all kinds of reservoirs. Traditions that have existed for thousands of years have developed all kinds of interpretations and different practices and so on that may have been forgotten or ignored in the course of time. And in studying other religious traditions, I have also sort of come back to rediscover figures in my own tradition and types of practice in my own tradition that I didn't really know about, or that are being also rediscovered or reawakened by other figures. So, there's of course a lot of attention to forms of practice that are indebted to Hindu and Buddhist traditions that have led to a recovery, for example, of the Hesychast Jesus prayer in the Christian tradition, which is a very ancient type of prayer in Christianity that's close to maybe Hindu or Buddhist uses of mantras, but that's a kind of Christian mantra that I didn't know about, honestly, until I started studying these traditions and became aware also of Christian movements that have sort of also worked on rediscovering those kinds of practices. I think there's so many different ways in which I use some ideas and some interpretations from other traditions to reinterpret or aspects of my own religious tradition without feeling like it's a departure or outside of the bonds of my own religious tradition. So it has also led to me reappreciating aspects of my own tradition. So I've learned a lot.
Let me just, because now it's natural that we move on to your 6 categories when it comes to the meanings and methods you already mentioned and discovery. I'm really keen to listen to how you develop those categories and why did you put them together just in that way. It starts with intensification, right?
So these are types of learning that I have come to notice over the course of time. I've been in this field for several decades now and read a lot of comparative theology that is done by other scholars. And so I'm always interested in questions of method, and I've started to see sort of patterns of ways in which other scholars have learned from other religious traditions. And so on the basis of that, in the course of time, I've developed sort of 6 types of learning that I've noticed or that are possible, I think, in engaging other religious traditions. So intensification has to do with putting together or side by side particular texts or practices that are analogous across religious traditions and that have the effect of reinforcing sort of certain elements of one's own tradition. So that's one type of learning that is sort of affirming certain aspects of your own tradition by multiplying and by seeing it multiplied or repeated in other religious traditions. Mm-hmm. A second type of learning is what I call rectification. And this is a type of learning that I've come to notice, in fact, only recently, and mostly as a result of also post-colonial critical reflections that have to do with the way in which one religion has used or abused another religious tradition for its own purposes and has defined itself in terms of a misunderstanding of another religious tradition. And so the rectification has to do with rectifying or restoring the other tradition to its authentic self-understanding, and thereby, by rectifying your understanding of the other, that has an effect also in then how you understand yourself. If you sort of compare a caricature of another religion with an ideal form of yourself, then that's not quite fair or honest. So that's the second type of learning or change that comes about through comparative theology. A third type I call recovery or rediscovery, and that's what I was talking about before, where engaging other religious tradition brings you back to your own and helps you to see aspects that you had forgotten, that were neglected, that were declared heretical, maybe even in the course of time, and then seeing maybe what were the reasons why this particular figure or this particular practice was denied or rejected, and are there ways in which we can sort of look at it again and see whether it still has some validity. And then the fourth type is reinterpretation, and that's where you use categories of another religion or even whole philosophical frameworks to reinterpret your own religious tradition. I don't know, I mean, in Christianity, that is happening quite a bit on the part of theologians who are fascinated by Hindu and Buddhist forms of non-duality. I don't know how much this is also happening in other religious tradition, but certainly it's quite prominent in Christianity. The fifth type of learning is then appropriation. That's, I know, an ugly word, and that seems like, you know, stealing elements from another religious tradition, but it is what happens, and it happens across religious traditions, and we can go into the ethics of that or the propriety of that, but it has to do with elements that you find inspiring in other religious traditions that are not present in your own, and that you wish were present. It has to do with this kind of idea of envy, holy envy, that is also sort of a category that is quite common in interreligious dialogue, where you're envious of an element of another religious tradition and you wish it was part of your own tradition, and you try to see whether there's room in your own tradition to integrate that. So it's a form of appropriation or integration, or however you want to call it. And then finally, I think comparative theology also should recognize the fact that engaging other religious traditions sometimes also brings you back to reappreciating certain distinctive elements of your own tradition that you took for granted before. So interreligious or comparative theology is not always just a matter of, you know, idealizing the other religion and looking at what you can learn from them, but also suddenly seeing that there are aspects of validity, truth, beauty in your own tradition that you hadn't taken account of or value in your own tradition, that you suddenly rediscover also. So it's a form of rediscovery, but insofar as it's sort of a little bit more apologetic than the idea of recovery or rediscovery, I wanted to make that into a different category, because I do feel like the practice of apologetics that was sort of part of interreligious encounter, where you just sort of define or defend the truth of your own religion over against the other. Sometimes comparative theology stays away from that kind of confrontational aspect, but if you're honest about questions of truth, then I think that should also be part of comparative theology, where you also reaffirm certain elements of your own tradition over against the other tradition. And sometimes as a result also of engaging the other tradition, those elements are themselves also somewhat reinterpreted. But, I mean, it would take too long to go into examples of that. But what I've tried to do with these 6 types of learning is, and I'm glad to hear that you benefited from that, is to also offer sort of people in the field, people who are doing the work of comparative theology, a way of placing themselves, so of reflecting on what they are doing when they're doing it. Because comparative theology has sort of developed in the past 30 years and gone into all these different directions and different ways of doing it and so on. And what I try to do in this method book is just sort of tightening things up and trying to create a framework or a blueprint that would allow people who are doing it to recognize, oh, this is what I'm doing, and this is where I find myself, or these are other ways of doing it that I could engage in.
Yes, it was when a Catholic colleague of mine, Klaus von Storch, whom you know very well, and I wrote our book on Mary. The last 2 chapters, we used those 6 categories developed and explained and gathered together by you. And it was really an eye-opener because, as you said, it helped us to orientate ourselves. How did we start? What have we gone through within the process of doing comparative theology together, and what are the results? And it helped us to distinguish and to recognize consciously what has happened during that process. And yes, we really did appreciate to be able to use, and it was in our final chapter, and your book was just released, and it was in time that we managed to do so. When you explained your categories, it relates maybe to a question from the chat, which asks you, have you wishes for further developments of comparative theology, for the future of comparative theology? Do you see urgent needs? Do you see maybe developments which you would say are maybe problematic? What are your wishes for the future?
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure there's anything that is sort of urgent in my mind, but because everything is urgent in the sense that there is such a field out there to be explored, and so many aspects to study, or so many elements to study, so many aspects of different traditions to engage in. One of the ways in which some scholars have moved in comparative theology is by focusing not just on texts and teachings, but also on aspects of ritual practice and lived experience, also in comparative theology. And I think that's a very helpful expansion of comparative theology. I also
can you explain why do you think it's a helpful expansion?
Because, what I don't agree with, some people talk about a ritual turn in comparative theology. I don't agree that it has to be, or that it is a turn. I think ritual is an important part of religion, and people engage in comparative theology also sometimes focusing on ritual practices, or they do ritual practices. And then as comparative theologians, I think it's our responsibility to reflect critically and constructively on the practices that are being integrated within our own religious traditions. So I do think that theology is still always a conceptual and textual exercise. It's always a written reflection on something. But I do think, and that relates to another important future domain for comparative theology, is to not focus only on what we find as theologians possibly inspiring, or putting together texts and practices and teachings, but looking at what people are doing in society at large. Or now that we live in such a plural religious context, believers are spontaneously adopting elements from different religious traditions. And so I think instead of just randomly comparing aspects of different religious traditions, I think we have a responsibility also as comparative theologians to offer a kind of second order, you can say, theological reflection on what is happening on the ground, or what is happening in societies.
I understand, yes.
And to sort of help people sort of see whether what they are doing is coherent or not. There are so many Christians who believe in reincarnation, let's say. And so as comparative theologians, we can then, think and look at the history of reincarnation in other traditions and in Christianity, and see why and how and whether it fits. So that's just one example of how I think comparative theology can offer something by doing this kind of second order reflection. I think the main challenge also for comparative theology is to relate what we do back to the mainstream of our respective traditions. So how can we inform what non-comparative theologians are doing in our respective traditions?
Yes.
So I always say comparative theology is fundamental systematic theology also, but we have a responsibility also to engage other theologians who don't do comparative theology, and that's to me also a big challenge for the future, how we do that and make what we do relevant for our traditions. So
I'm sorry, we have a time slot, and we are already 1 minute transgressed it. We have to come to an end, Catherine. I would like to thank you so much for this very inspiring conversation, for your enriching thoughts, and yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you and to listen to your thoughts. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.